Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me. I want to take a few minutes today to give you a really powerful message. When people first get tinnitus, or in the early days, they often go through what we call as the cycle of tinnitus. And there's some distinct stages that people go through which you might be going through right now. And I want to explain and clarify for you the different stages that people go through so that you can avoid some of the big mistakes that people make, which are really detrimental for later management of tinnitus, because tinnitus often can become a much bigger problem for yourself later if you don't deal with it in the right way when it first starts. So this cycle is referred to in different terms. Sometimes we refer to it as the revolving door of tinnitus because it captures the idea that people get their tinnitus, they go through a certain pathway, they often repeat the cycle. But however we refer to it, there are some distinct stages that I'd like to clarify for you today. So when the first stage clearly is that somebody first hears their tinnitus. Now, tinnitus, as we've said, is defined as a sound that you hear in your head or in your ears that isn't coming from the outside world. So when you first hear that sound, and it can be any sound, most people describe it as a buzzing or a rushing, but it can be any sound. When you first hear the tinnitus that you've got, you're obviously going to be quite confused. So the hearing of the sound often sparks off certain habits or thinking processes or practices. Now, some people go out and start searching for the sound. My wife, for example, recently said that she's had a number of different sounds that she hears, but quite recently she said, is the Tesla on? And I said, no. And she said, well, it's because whenever I'm getting a tinnitus, that really sounds like your Tesla is parking up in the driveway. So people often will go and search for their tinnitus. They'll turn off things and look for where that sound is coming from. And it often takes a little bit of time for people to realize that actually nobody else can hear it and only they're hearing that sound. So when you're first aware of your tinnitus, you're naturally going to be very interested in it. And this is the first point that is often determined. How you react to your tinnitus is often determined by things outside of your control. We all have a certain psychological makeup. We all react to situations in different ways, and some people will react to new novel situations in a way in which they're intrigued by it, they want to know more about it, they're not so stressed about it, and other people will react quite negatively to a new situation like this. Now, I would say invariably most people don't like the idea that they're hearing a sound, and that's more than likely because for most people it's a unknown, and the unknown is quite scary, isn't it? So we start thinking about, is it a threat to my health? What does this mean? Why is this happening to me? So when we have these thinking processes, when we first hear our tinnitus, we're giving signals to our lower subconscious brain that this signal that I'm hearing, this sound I'm hearing, is something that I'm concerned about, something that I don't really like. And your subconscious brain then kicks into gear and it pays attention to your tinnitus. So one of the first things that happens when you first hear your tinnitus is if you're doing what I just said and you start researching it and worrying about it and thinking about it, you're giving very early signals to your subconscious brain that this is a threat, you don't like it. And the natural reaction then, the way we're made up physiologically, is that our brains will pay even more attention to the sound. So practically what happens is you become more aware of your tinnitus. That's stage 2, increased awareness. So the stage 3 is often that there is a negative reaction to your tinnitus. So you've heard the sound, you're paying even more attention to it, and now you start feeding into the sound by layering on top of it your own worries and concerns. So as I said, it's quite natural to be concerned about your tinnitus in the early days because clearly you've never heard it before, you've never had a reason to research it, it might be the first time you're ever coming across it in your life, and it's an unknown. So you might be sitting there really worried, panicking, thinking, what does this mean? Does this mean I'm going to get ill? What often people will do is they'll go and they'll start searching online on forums, on Google, on YouTube. You might have found this video because of that, and I'm thankful you have. But there's many things that people do that actually heightens their anxiety. So they start increasingly worrying about their tinnitus. And that's one of the things, if I could practically stop in these early days is actually doing that. But it's a natural reaction, and people will often only find the right advice when they go through the bad advice first. And the problems with forums and places like that are unvetted or uncontrolled by professionals is tinnitus is such a variable experience that no two experiences are ever going to be the same. And what you'll often end up when you go on a forum is you're going to find messages and posts by people that have struggled the most with tinnitus. You're not going to get the types of people that have heard it and are managing quite well. They're not going to bother going on a forum and talking about it. So what ends up happening is you get a negative feedback loop, and you start to increase your worries that, am I going to have to live with this forever? Is this ever going to go away? And that negative thinking then makes the tinnitus even more pronounced, and it makes your brain even more concerned about it. And you can see now how this feedback loop is starting. So stage 3 is an increased awareness of your tinnitus, and you're feeling quite isolated, you're feeling quite alone. Not people around you often don't understand when you share it with them, and they can't obviously experience what you're experiencing. So stage 3 was a negative reaction. Stage 4 is even more awareness of your tinnitus because of that negative reaction. So now you're feeding further and you're even more aware of your tinnitus, and at this point you're really quite concerned. Now it might be 2 to 3 months of living in this stage before you actually go and do anything about it, because a lot of people hope that it's just going to go away. It came on sporadically, maybe it's going to go away sporadically, and that's understandable. So they've been living with this negativity, this increased awareness, these feedback loops for often 2 to 3 to 4 months, sometimes even longer, sometimes a little bit shorter. And that's the first time people often go and try and get some professional advice. So most people obviously will go to their GP, and they'll go sit with their GP and they'll say, I'm hearing this sound, it's really concerning me, and is there anything you can do about it? And obviously they've gone to the GP, like most of us, because we want a cure. You know, we want a tablet, we want something that we can take to manage this problem. I won't go into the depths today about that early consultation with the GP, but that is such a critical consultation. Now, obviously, a lot of GPs, they are general practitioners, and most GPs won't have a detailed knowledge of tinnitus, and they won't know exactly what needs to be said at that moment in time. But this is such a crucial appointment, because when you're seeing that GP, that's your lifeline. You're really hopeful, you're at your final tether, and you really want that GP to say that it's okay, don't worry, there's something we can do about it. But often people get the complete opposite message. The message they get is, I'm sorry, you've got tinnitus, there's no cure, and there's nothing anybody can do about it, you're just going to have to live with it. And you can imagine the weight that sits on people when they first hear that. This is the one person they've come to for advice, and they're thinking, how am I going to live with this for the rest of my life? Not knowing what we know, which is that tinnitus does get better. And we'll talk about this later in detail, about how tinnitus gets better based upon the process of habituation and many other methods. But at that moment in time, people are really devastated by that piece of information. Now, if the GP does their job properly and the person is clearly concerned about their tinnitus, they can either just self-manage, and they can give them some good information to go home and read, and websites that they might go on. And if they really need of some advice, they really should see an audiologist. So people then sometimes, if the correct thing happens, they'll often go to an ear, nose and throat consultant, and eventually they'll come and see an audiologist who is trained to manage the tinnitus, and that's when the formal process of managing tinnitus begins. But getting to an audiologist is so crucial for so many people, and often it doesn't happen at all, or it happens much later than it should do. So when they see an audiologist, the treatment starts, and often people manage, once they've seen an audiologist, they get the right care. If they get good care, they're often in a situation where they're thankfully managing quite well, and they can often leave the cycle of tinnitus completely, and they can self-manage for the rest of their lives. Other people, however, repeat that cycle. Sometimes they don't get the best advice from an audiologist, they're not happy, they don't feel appeased, and they start to think about their tinnitus, and they go through that cycle all over again. Other people manage quite well temporarily, and then some time in the future, it could be years, months, sometimes tinnitus changes, and they've got very used to a certain type of sound, and then they get an additional sound, or the sound gets a lot louder. And the cycle starts again, because either it's been too long and they've forgotten, or they haven't been prepared for that change. So I thought it was really important for you to understand those stages of tinnitus management. It's essential that we as professionals share this with you, because wherever you are on that cycle, the more you know, the more empowered you feel, the more you can start to move past where you are right now. In the next videos, I'll be going through how I'll educate you more about tinnitus and what you need to know in the early stages, and then we'll move on eventually to talk about some of the treatments and some of the common causes. So lots and lots to come. I look forward to sharing this with you. Thank you so much.